I come back to this wonderful quote from Zora Neale Hurston. And she was asked about research, and she said it's formalized curiosity. And so a lot of times I say to people at the end of the day, I'm in the business of curiosity.
Hello, I'm Emmy DeGrappa. Each week, we bring you stories asking our guests the question, why? We learn about their passion, why they do what they do, why should we care, and what can we learn? What better place to explore the human landscape than from the state known for its incredible landscapes, Wyoming? And what better organization than Wyoming Humanities? Serving our state for over 45 years, we share stories, ideas, and wisdom about the human experience. This is What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to Jon Peede. He is the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Welcome, Chairman Peede.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. Tell us about the work of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is also otherwise known as the NEH, and your role as chairman.
So the NEH is this remarkable agency, and it was started in 1965 as a federal agency, and it was part of the Great Society legislation from LBJ, and I think that was important. It was, in many ways, an aspirational federal agency. What I love about the NEH is that it's a federal agency that grew out of a particular time, the Great Society legislation from LBJ. So in many ways, it's an aspirational federal agency. And our initial legislation talked about democracy demanding vision. And so the idea is that this agency, through federal grants, will support the humanities, will in many ways make that vision manifest. So we support libraries, historians, documentary filmmakers, cultural institutions. And so it is in many ways an embodiment of what it means to be a curious and engaged American.
And so in that role of the NEH, how do you serve and what's your vision for the National Endowment for the Humanities as an organization just nationally, and how does it be like boots on the ground for every state?
Absolutely. So a couple of things. Our budget is $120 million a year in terms of our grants budget. So in that sense, we're always going to be catalytic. We're never going to be the 100% funder of a project. Frankly, I think that's good, because what that means is there is local buy-in. The local community, the state, the region is saying, this is our heritage. This is important to us. And so that's something. Here we are in this remarkable collection of museums here with the Buffalo Bill Center, and that's an example of the people of Wyoming saying, this matters to us, this history matters to us, not just for tourists, but for our own state and for the education of our children. So as a chairman, I am going across the country and talking to people about their local history, trying to make sure that we keep this level of civic engagement alive. So it might be school kids and programs for children, but we might be supporting historians, archaeologists. So it is a diverse portfolio. But I think the main thing is to ask, what is it doing for the public? How is it changing lives? How is it enriching our understanding of this nation?
Is there a difference between scholarly humanities and public humanities, and what is that difference?
I don't think there has to be a difference. Take some historians such as David McCullough, or you can take the Ken Burns documentary, and we funded every Ken Burns film since its first one. Both of those individuals are popular historians in different genres, but at the same time, they have scholarly respect. Having said that, we certainly also have scholars who come to us, and they are focusing on a very narrow matter. They're not giving the history of the Civil War. They're talking about the history of a particular battle. They're talking about a particular weapon, for example, or the cannon, or a particular strategy of war. And so that's an example where a scholar may be more narrow in focus, and their writing may be of only of interest to other academic historians of that topic. And then, of course, we have those wonderful public histories. Again, you see it on PBS, so many that we fund. And the agency has also, in recent years, reached out to support books that are more accessible to the general public.
Here's a question that I get asked all the time. So I'm just going to ask you to hear your answer. What are the humanities?
Good question. I spent a lot of my career in the arts, and that's an easier question to answer. The humanities are ultimately about understanding and exploring the human condition. So at the university level, that's often thought of as the liberal arts. So history, archaeology, law, government, political science, literature, arts. But as opposed to creating art, which would be the focus of the National Endowment for the Arts, our sister agency, we're involved in the study of these fields. So not the creation of art, but the study of art. And I think a nice way of framing it, if you want to think about research, I come back to this wonderful quote from Zora Neale Hurston. She's a great folklorist, novelist, really Central American writer, Central African American writer. And she was asked about research, and she said it's formalized curiosity. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times I say to people at the end of the day, I'm in the business of curiosity.
That's interesting because I say I'm in the business of critical thinking and creating conversations. One of my colleagues, when she was talking to some students during a fair that we were at, we had a booth, and they said, what are the humanities? And she said, well, think about it like this. The arts do it and we talk about it. And I was like, that's a really good way to think about it, because sometimes it's hard for people to get their heads around what exactly are the humanities. And that brings me to my other question for you, is that if the only way we know the humanities is on the college campuses because they're areas of study, then how does that translate into the general public's knowledge of the humanities? How do we relate to the general public where it's not just a scholar, but it's someone who is just having a conversation about politics or books, for example?
So I think one of the challenges, you certainly hit on one of the challenges, is that the humanities are often seen, correctly or not, as being limited to the walls of campuses. And I think that's an impoverished understanding of the humanities. I think they're more vital to our communities than that. I think they're more vital to an engaged citizenship than that. So we need to, in terms of those federal leaders, we need to talk about the importance of the humanities, the importance of learning, of civics education in particular, across our curriculum at the school age, but also continuing learning, whether that's young adults, whether that's seniors. So that means that our libraries offering educational programming, and that may be a film one week, that may be a brief concert that has music, and then somebody explains the roots of this music. And in terms of the discussion you touched about, the difference between the arts and the humanities, when we think of the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA versus the NEH, a frame of reference is that one supports the creation of art and the presentation of it, the NEA. And the NEH preserves it. And sometimes, of course, we are certainly involved in presenting it with our state partners. But the act of preserving culture is a major part of the humanities at the national and the state level.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I just try and figure out why it is that when you say the National Endowment for the Arts, that's easily recognizable. What do we need to do to ensure that people understand the importance of the humanities?
Well, first, I think we need to be, again, out there publicly, and we need to talk about it with a level of enthusiasm. It is a remarkable thing to talk about American history and our role in the world. And when I'm here, for example, just being in Cody in the area to think about the transformation not just of this nation, but whether it's of the land, whether it's of world history, when we talk about Buffalo Bill, when we talk about and some of tragic ways, such as the internment camp that was here during World War II for Japanese and Japanese American citizens. And so one part of, I think, doing this is to have a vocabulary that is engaging the public, that we're not talking in very esoteric, very academic ways, but we're saying, here's what happened in this time, in this place. Here's how this land was affected by westward expansion, for example. These are oral histories with Native Americans whose written records were not held together through the continual removal to reservations. And so it's a matter of talking about it in a more holistic way about American history, and not just defining it as these large cities and these large activities, the American Revolution, the Civil War, the Transcontinental Railroad, but realizing that the nation's history is made up of thousands of quiet, often unknown stories.
And in talking about that, how do we get our young people involved in loving history, in wanting to know where they came from and why that's important? How are you going to reach a younger audience for the humanities?
I think one essential part of it is experiential learning. So if they can experience it, if they can participate in it, I think that means, for example, having very different approaches to museums. Instead of everything being behind glass walls and kind of barriers, it's the idea that they need to be able to engage this with all their senses. They need to be able to feel a historic object, to have it recreated visually, to be able to smell it. It's the idea of engaging as completely as you possibly can this experience. And I also think that there are those times in our formation then we are naturally inclined toward expressing ourselves and experiencing things. It's not a small secret that children all paint when they're in elementary school, and they take their piano lessons and they sing depending on the school, and we have all these immersive experiences, and we need to think of the humanities as that immersive experience, and then we need to have sequential learning that keeps that in front of them, as opposed to saying, here it is in a book. And it's a dry experience. And I say this as somebody who loves books, collects books, could not live without books. But that which we participate in registers in our minds much more completely. And I think, too, those of us that are on the more academic side of things, we spent so much time dissecting this battle, that battle, overturning the critical thinking that came before us. And in many ways, that's inside baseball. And what I would like to see professors doing across the country is speaking a lot more about why they love this field. And so to take our finest professors, our full professors, our great scholars, and to have them not only teaching grad students, but teach a freshman class. This idea of at the intersection when they're coming to form their career, to say that this is something that I care enough about that I'm going to be the one teaching the gateway classes. And the other part of that, I would say, is we have to understand that people are going to move into other fields. So they'll go into banking, they'll go into law, they'll go into any number of fields, that they don't all have to become humanists by profession. That they can be great patrons of the arts. They can be audience members for the humanities. That we don't want to have any artificial barriers between who is in that circle of participants.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned in one of the articles I read about you is that you were one of the only chairmen of the humanities that is not considered a quote-unquote scholar. Why? What does that mean?
Well, and I think I probably self-labeled myself that. I've been a journalist. I've edited 2 books, and I've published probably 100 pieces or so. But I recognize the difference between myself and a scholar at the level that gives the Jefferson Lecture for our agency. So C. Van Woodward or some of these remarkable scholars we've had over the years. And I think that means that I'm more naturally on the side of the public humanities, that I spent a lot of my career as an editor, for example. And an editor is always thinking about the audience, right? It's not just here's what I found, here's my research, and I'm going to present it to the world, and if they like it, great. If they don't, fine. That might be the way I feel as a writer writing in isolation. But an editor often begins with the audience and works backwards and says, for example, is a book the best way to do this? Or would it be a podcast as we have? I think about the digital humanities and how some stories would be better in that medium. Some would be better in audiovisual versus the written word. So I think it is a different frame of reference. And some of it's generational. I'm the only chairman born after, I think, 1947. So the other chairmen were born in the 1910s, 1930s, and 40s. So I'm the only one after the Truman administration. So that means, for example, that the digital humanities are just the humanities for me. I never had a significant career job when the internet did not exist.
Oh, that's really interesting. You're a young chairman. Are you the youngest?
No, I think in the 70s there was a younger chairman.
Okay.
Yeah.
What would you say about the intersection of, because the humanities encompasses literature and culture and history, and what about the intersection of humanities and science?
Well, that's a very popular area. I can say we're seeing a lot of grants in that area, and a couple of things. One is medical humanities have become a huge issue. I think, and a parallel issue is narrative medicine, the idea that we want physicians and healthcare providers who think of us more holistically, as not just this replaceable set of people to run tests against, but you're really starting to listen to the experience of a patient beyond just what the machines tell you. So we're certainly seeing that. But there is a natural overlap in the sciences and the humanities. We spend a lot of our time funding advanced humanities study. That might mean archaeology, for example. That can also mean advances related to chemistry so that we can protect artifacts. When you think about we're just trying to date an object and figure out what century it's in, that is something where the sciences come together quite closely with the humanities, because the sciences are a tool by which we unlock levels of understanding about objects, for example, and help us, of course, to preserve those objects.
Do you think one of the challenges of the humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities, but in humanities in general, is that they've put themselves in a box where we only consider these subjects humanities and not these other subjects?
Well, I certainly think, for example, that the division between the humanities and the arts is largely artificial and is a function of the university. So in the university, you're going to get tenure in political science or government or law, and these are separate boxes. But of course, out in the world of scholarship or as an audience member, I don't say, oh, today is my arts day and tomorrow's my humanities day. It is in other ways, it is my learning day. It is when I'm going to have a rich experience. And so as a citizen, I don't put it in those boxes, but I think we carry that over sometimes from the academy into the other side of the humanities, and I don't think that's necessary. So that's one thing I would say about my chairmanship, is having worked for almost a decade at the NEA and the NEH together, I am much more broad in terms of thinking through where the humanities end.
That's excellent. And I'm so excited to have you here. Thank you for talking to me today.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Your Why, a production of Think Why, Wyoming Humanities. This has been executive producer Emmy DeGrappa. Please subscribe and never miss a show. For more information, go to thinkwhy.org.